Today, since we have a shortened period of time to work, we've made a decision to change things up a little bit. The original plan was to go into session number 6, which is about Solomon, where strong men are vulnerable. So I'm going to just touch on that for probably about a good minute or so, then we'll go into the area that our hearts brought us to go in the direction today. For anyone who's not familiar with Solomon, I'm sure we are to some degree, Solomon, when he became king, he was a young man. And his father David was still alive at the time. And God came to him and said, I'll give you anything that you want. And David, instead of asking for riches, instead of asking for power, Solomon asked for wisdom. Wisdom so that he can guide his nation. God was so pleased with the fact that he asked for wisdom, that God not only gave him wisdom, but he also gave him great wealth and great power. Now, when Solomon got this great wisdom and power, he still was young and had to prove himself. And there's a few examples I'll just go over really quick. There was an example of 2 women that lived, in the same home. And they both had babies around the same age. And in the morning time, one of the babies had passed away. And that mother went straight to Solomon and said, hey, you know what? My baby is the baby that's still alive, and this mother's trying to take the baby away. So he said, showing his wisdom, he wasn't able to tell which mother was telling the truth. I mean, if you think about it, if any one of you have ever listened to perhaps maybe one of the daytime shows, if you was a day off, and you have both sides that are telling the truth, they're telling their stories, and it seems you just don't know which one is true. And then you have to do like a DNA test or something like that to be able to tell who was actually telling the truth. We didn't have that at that time, so what he did was he said, okay, bring the baby here, cut the baby in half, and you take one half and you take the other. The mother of the child cried and said, no, give the baby to her because she cared for the baby. The other woman said, cut him in half. That showed and so at that point, Solomon said, this is the mother, give the child to the mother. That amazed many people in the nation that he had such wisdom. Another thing that happened was he had built from a lot of intermarriages with different other nations. He had built a very, very strong nation. And it was so to the point that people would come from all over the world just to see the power and the majesty of his great nation that he had built. And then when you look at it from there, he had great wisdom, he had great strength. In fact, to this day, there was never a king more powerful than Solomon. But God also told him, do not intermarry with certain groups of people, certain nations that were not, Israel. He told them not to, but he kind of got ahead of himself. He had 700 wives, 300 concubines. You would think that, God told Adam, you can eat of all of these trees. He would be satisfied. But I'm sure, with temptation being the way that it is, these women from the other nations were probably, very attractive. Either which way, he told them not to intermarry with him because he knew that the power that he gave women, he knew that the power that he gave women to persuade men as their helpmates would lead him to look at other gods, to worship other gods. So what he did was he started to do the intermarrying with these other nations, and sooner or later, just as God predicted, he would begin to worship those other gods. And this right there was something that God wasn't about to accept. But the great thing about God and his promises is that his promises to David, Solomon's father, was that his seed would continue to rule over the nation. He let Solomon stay in his position for the rest of his life, but his children, they would have to suffer from his actual deeds. So when we look at where strong men are vulnerable, Solomon is probably about the best person to look at, because he was a very strong man, but he had that temptation, and there was a weakness. And it's important to look at that, because many of us, we have, we deal with different levels of temptation too. But this is something that, really brought down his not his kingdom in his lifetime, but definitely in his future generations. I know that is a very, very shortened version of Solomon, but we're going to move forward.